just with a couple of little announcements. So I'm going to give you a sheet of paper at the end of this that on it has 2 links down here at the bottom of the second page. Those 2 links are one from Art and one from myself. So let me show you what they are. Somewhere here. Oh, okay. So Art shared this. This is a TED Talk by Ibram Kendi that you might want to read. And it specifically talks about much of what we're going to do today, the difference between being not racist and anti-racist. And it's about a 50-minute long piece. And so if you'd like to do that, the link will be on that sheet of paper. Second of all, I want to show you the one that that is the talk.
Yeah, that's the
I want to show you what the General Commission on Religion and Race of the United Methodist Church is doing. There's a page that you can go to, and there's lots of different things that are there. There's online courses like this, First Steps for White Christians on Race and Racism. Communion liturgy, Black Lives Matter. So several different things, but I want to show you this one right here, 30 Days of Anti-Racism. So through the month of September, they have a calendar set up with a number of different, I was going to say small steps, but they're not quite small steps. They are maybe simple, but that might challenge you. And so the one for today is pray about how God is calling you to act around anti-racism. And so as you go through the month, there will be a number of different tasks that are there. Develop your racial autobiography, engage in the difficult conversation, engage in local community organizing, just all kinds of things that help you to maybe step towards some of the things that we're going to talk about during our time together. All right. So that list will get to you. On the sheet of paper that I showed you. All right.
Jim,
Yes.
Arizona Faith Network also has an Eye on the Prize. I'll send you the link to that if you want. But it's
is that the old not old, but the set of movies that
if you see Eye on the Prize and then different people talk about, who have been involved in it or are interested in being anti-racist in Arizona.
Okay, so send us that link and then we'll...
And it started last night and then it's every other Monday through the end of February.
Okay, that sounds good. So basically what we're trying to do here is three different, distinguish between 3 different words and being sure that we get to the one we need. Racist, not racist, I'm using that as one word even though it's 2, and then anti-racist. Mm-hmm. How many have at some point in your life said, I'm not racist? And you meant it as a positive thing. You meant it as well, I'm not like them, which is good that you're not like that. But what we're trying to move towards is not just being not racist, because Ibram Kendi, I think, would say that's kind of still racist. How are you going to be anti-racist so that you are actively and aggressively even taking a different stance in all of this? So I want you to start by reading an article that I'm putting up in front of you. That's the whole thing. If you'll just read through that very quickly, that will help the start of our discussion.
Can you make bigger print?
I can, but it won't fit on the page any longer. So I'll have to scroll through it. Would you like it larger and then have me scroll down after a little bit?
Sure. That would help me.
Okay,
yeah.
I will do that.
Thank you.
That's good.
I need the first line though.
I'm getting there, sorry.
You're there.
All right, so you can see that the basis of this is trying to describe what happens, what has happened and what continues to happen in who we are as people in America specifically. And that much of that is dictated by a way that we have gone from being whatever the disparate tribes are that we are, into this melting pot idea that sometimes says stop being who you were and become something, often against what somebody else is. And the easiest way to be against somebody is to look and say, he is of darker skin, he is of red skin, he is of whatever. She is of a different gender then. And we've often done that. And how do we reverse that trend? This basic thing, oh, by the way, the author of this piece is Ta-Nehisi Coates. If you haven't read his book, Between the World and Me, it's a fascinating book. It's like a letter to his son, and it's trying to say what his view of the world. So he says, race is the child of racism, not the father. That we build up these reasons to hate one another so that we feel better about that hate. We look and we say, Michael has a bald head, so I don't like him. And I begin building up why that's a horrible thing, right? And it could be any number of things that we do that about, right?
Jim, we do have a tendency to categorize. I think that's part of human nature. So
right, and we need to categorize in some ways, but it's not the categorization; it's the value we put on the categorization.
Yeah.
Let Art finish.
No,
I thought you were.
Yeah, no, I was. I just saying that we inherently want to categorize, so it's dangerous. We got to be careful what we do with that information once we get it.
So as you introduce yourself today, I want you to say, here's one thing that I was taught of how to put somebody in a category, and if you can, a way that you were taught to make that category somewhat lower than you. Okay? And so from my background, Mormonism, which is a great space to be from, there's also a sense that women are only meant to be in the home. That's a lowering of their capabilities as a gender, right? But that was one of the things that I was taught growing up. How about you? Do you want me to call on you, or would you rather just speak up when you're ready?
Call on us.
Okay, so I'll just go to the top of my screen. Art, you're first.
I'm sorry, Jim. What was the question?
Name yourself so that everyone knows you, and then some way that you were taught to categorize somebody as in a lower way, or different at least, but if you can, lower.
Yeah. Well, I'm Art Aldag, and lower. Well, I guess growing up in Chicago, I did tend to look at African Americans in a lower sense. I mean, that was part of the structure of that time when I was growing up. You know, so yeah.
And I'm guessing, Art, that as in most big cities, it's not just blacks, it was all the other different neighborhoods. And you had views of who the people in that neighborhood were.
Yeah, all the Polish jokes, you know.
Yep.
And all.
Yes, whatever they happen to be. Peggy?
Yeah, as I mentioned in the last class, I lived in West Virginia until I was 12. And I didn't realize it, but racism was a way of life, and I was taught that way of life. I was taught that, in fact, my grandmother told me Black people were here to serve me.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I'm sure being from West Virginia, there was a certain amount of those people in the next holler over.
Oh yeah.
Which is
Hollers were a
another
big
way,
deal.
right?
Yeah, right. Hillbillies, yes.
Yeah, Dixie?
I'm Dixie Siegel. I grew up in Colorado, And I can remember growing up, I was from what we call the Lower East Side, and which was, you know, pretty blue collar area. But we always said, well, we're from the Lower East Side, but we're not from Dogpatch, which was from the cartoon. Pretty derogatory way to speak of a town, part of town and people.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Virginia.
I grew up in New Jersey. And it was very clear that I went to school with African Americans. We called them Negroes. But they certainly only lived in a certain area of town, which wouldn't be where we would live. But the ones that, so we didn't talk about that so much, but it was very clear, what was made clear to me was that Catholics were not okay. And particularly Italian Catholics.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you. And
Yeah.
there was nothing around divisions going across the Hudson River, was there? There was no view back and forth between people on one side of the Hudson or the other, right?
I didn't understand your question.
There was no kind of diminishment as you looked across the river at the people on the other side of the Hudson, or them from that side of the Hudson back at you, right?
No.
Not at all.
Yeah, no, yeah. The city was a draw.
Yeah, absolutely. Barbara, how about you?
I grew up in Illinois, one Black family in the whole town, actually outside of town. So I didn't have really any experience that I was aware of in terms of feeling less or more. I mean, that family was a member of our church and was, you know, well loved and whatever. What I got the message about was that people who were heavy were not as good. They weren't as moral. They weren't as self-disciplined. Yeah, that was definitely a better than, worse than.
Thank you, Barbara. Kay?
Well, I grew up in Michigan, in Midland, in an all-white community because Dow Chemical didn't hire Blacks, Jews, Latinos, Puerto Ricans, anybody like that. But when I think of what, it's still gender that was more unequal in my upbringing. It never occurred to me, and I've told a couple of you this, some of you this story, that it never occurred to me all the way through high school, even though I was second highest in my class, salutatorian of a big class of over 550 people. It never occurred to me that I could be a physician, because as a woman, that wasn't even an option. So to me, it was more gender that I had to overcome when I went to college than for my own self, than race.
Go ahead. Yeah, gender is one of our biggest ways that we have often separated and diminished each other.
And diminished, yeah.
Yeah. Harvey?
Well, I think I may have told you earlier that my father was very much a racist. I grew up in North Long Beach, California, which was like a little piece of the Midwest transported to the West Coast. But he was very much a racist. And when they decided to move the projects into our neighborhood, he was completely incensed and joined a whole group of others who made them take down the projects and run the people out of town because he didn't want his kid going to school with any of those N-words.
Yeah. And what's funny about that, Harvey, is that often got diminished in our heads as being, I'm just making sure that it's right for my kids. Well, but if getting rid of them diminishes your kid, then what's it doing to them? Right?
Yeah, it was really funny because I had friends who were people of color from that area. And my father was incensed that I would be friends with someone from that area, from that project.
Michael?
I grew up in a little factory town in Massachusetts, and I learned that God's chosen people were Irish Catholics.
Mm-hmm.
And that if you were an Italian Catholic or a Polish Catholic, that almost counted, and nobody else did.
Yeah.
So none of the Protestant folks, we weren't even allowed to talk to the Jewish kids.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a whole bunch of those that where we say don't even
Right.
of certain groups of people. And Michael, sorry about them teasing you about your head. It's gorgeous. Pam, how about you?
I'm Pam Bison, and I was born in Ohio and lived there till I was 9, and then we moved to South Jersey. And it's interesting that you ask about, who we were told we were to associate with, and I don't ever remember my parents saying that. The girls that I associated with when I was later in middle school and high school, we were Catholic, Jewish, and Protestant all together. The town that we had moved to in New Jersey at that time was all 100% white, yet the high school had students from 2 other towns. It was a regional high school, and so it was also mixed. The only thing I have ever heard my mother say about any group that I thought, well, I knew she was being prejudiced, was after we had moved to New Jersey, and she would talk about greasy Italians. And so that was, but part of that, I think, is moving from, the Midwest, and that she really hadn't encountered them so much until that time.
Yeah.
My father, I know, was an athlete, and so he had African American friends, and I don't know that my mother ever did, but yeah, it's hard to know. But I have to tell you, I do have a very strong prejudice, and this is if I hear a really strong Southern accent, I have to work very hard not to believe that person is not very bright.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this is true of me, and so I try to cut myself off when the first thing, when I hear that accent, it's like, oh. But and I know I also have some underlying prejudice about all kinds of groups that we were never allowed to voice any kind of comments like that when we were growing up. But even if you know in your brain that something is not true, you still have things that you have grown up around people and heard things, and it's very difficult to get it out of your head.
But part of what you're describing, Pam, is because many of us grew up in relatively lily white spaces where we saw very few people of color. And so we learned a fear of, without it ever seeming to be a fear, a disassociation with, because we didn't know and didn't have a connection to. We didn't have any real person to assign it to.
Yeah.
And that's a whole different thing than if you grow up in Alabama, where you have a very mixed race town, where there are very strong social mores in one direction or another. I'm not certain if it's better or worse, because sometimes when you are lily white neighborhood born and bred, you don't internalize that you have prejudices, even though they definitely are affecting you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Judy, how about yourself?
Well, Judy West. I grew up in Charleston, West Virginia. And my class graduated in 1968, and we were the first class to go through kindergarten through 12th grade integrated.
Mm.
And I don't remember any kind of, I had black kids come over to my house, play and stuff, I don't remember any of that. And I know when I was in the 60s, my dad had I started realizing then that how racist he was. But it wasn't until then, and it wasn't towards my friends. It was towards like Martin Luther King Jr. and, the people stirring up trouble and stuff. And
Yeah.
so it was more of that.
Yeah. Thank you. But that's not uncommon. We all might have this person that we know they're not of the sort that like most of their people are, because this guy we know, this lady is a friend of ours, but most of the folks, like, you know what I'm saying? And in some ways that's really dangerous, because it allows us to say, but I have.
Stereotypes, right?
Yeah.
Well, it was the troublemakers, people who were agitators, stuff like that.
Absolutely. And I would believe that today that most of my friends who right now are decrying the Black Lives Matter movement would say, I'm not racist because I have these friends of mine that are, but those other people, they're not. Right? Phyllis.
Yes, I grew up also in South Chicago, and I was to stay only in my white neighborhood. We called it the other side of the tracks. And I was to go to an all-white high school, which I did not do. I ended up going to partially black, partially white high school. But my biggest one for my mother was not only the blacks, that was assumed, was Catholics.
Yeah.
And my best friend was Catholic, and she preferred that I not have her in the house because maybe her Catholic ways would disturb her strong Methodism.
Yeah.
That was probably the biggest trouble I had, was not allowing Lorraine in my house.
Isn't that interesting?
I did not tell her I went with Lorraine when she went to confession. We would walk home from school. Never told her I did that.
Yeah. So Becky, let's go to you. We're just introducing ourselves and saying one place where we were taught some way that somebody else was a diminished person in some way or another.
Oh, gee.
Or different, at least.
Well, I grew up outside St. Louis in Kirkwood, Missouri. And I remember distinctly the day in 1954 that the first time that I had a black student in my 6th grade class. But I think my parents were fine, but there were members of the family, some aunts and uncles. And I had one aunt in particular, but that was cultural in that area. I mean, it was very much, Dred Scott was right down at the courthouse steps down on the levee.
That's right.
So, before there was any arch or anything. So yeah, it was very separate because there was an area called Meacham Park, which was very separated, and they didn't even have sewers.
Yeah.
And so, I had an aunt who referred to them as darkies, but that had been that way in that part of the world forever.
Yeah. And I think it's sometimes those places where we have structured city and things to where we don't have to consider each other that become especially difficult. So look at this paragraph in particular. The new people were something else before they were white. Catholic, Corsican, Welsh, Mennonite, Jewish, and if our national hopes have any fulfillment, then they will have to be something else again. Okay? Many of you have described how they used to be those Catholics that we were against. That division between us and the Polish, or whatever it happened to be. But somehow we've been able to evolve to accept them as white enough and accept them into the circle of the acceptable. The question would be, at what expense? Right? What of their heritage have they lost? What have we lost? Because, for example, when the Berlin Wall fell, we had no people who spoke German or Russian or very few people, because we taught that out of our society. And so what we want to do, I mean, what we've wanted to do very often is whitewash everything. And black skin tone doesn't whitewash very easily. And so instead, we diminish them in other ways and never allow them to step into full personhood in society. Right? And so it talks about the process of washing the disparate tribes white. We have to start thinking about this otherwise. That the goal is not to be white, but it is to be something different than that. What should be our goal as human beings? What are some of the things that you see as a higher goal than being white, right? What do you hope that we are striving towards as a human race?
Kindness and compassion.
Thank you.
I was going to say respect.
Uh-huh. What else?
Hospitable.
Hospitable, thank you.
Kind.
Thank you.
I would say education.
Core, so love.
Love, thank you. Harvey, I heard you saying something.
No, I was actually scratching the palm
Oh,
of
okay.
my hand.
Right. I heard one other voice, but I didn't hear.
I think the ability to look past one's color and see a person, with that bias.
Yeah. Phyllis.
Education, because like what Harvey just said, I want to look past, get enough education that I can be accepting.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the understanding, just understanding somebody else and what they're, I guess that's empathy too.
Yeah, absolutely. Empathy is a huge thing.
There's also something about appreciating all people.
Yeah.
Or different people, and not only like being okay that they're in the neighborhood, but valuing their experience, valuing the differences, I guess.
Yeah, I want to think, for example, I want you to think about, like, we were just supposed to be through the Olympics, and in the Olympics, we will have these little teeny gymnastic women, like Dominique, who is a completely different type of athlete than this 7-foot tall basketball player. And to say that one or another is lesser as an athlete has no bearing, right? Because the one could not do what the other does in either direction, right?
Right.
And so what we have to do is try to say, okay, what is this shape and size of body and spirit meant for? And how do we help that person live out to the fullest?
I think we need to appreciate cultural differences as well, not just be aware of the cultural differences. I mean, we've all sometimes heard Black slang, especially with rap music and everything. My daughter's a big rap music fan, so I heard a lot of it when she was in high school. And you know, sometimes it's easy to overlook it because it's not something that we're necessarily interested in. But I think if we delve into those cultures and understand where the music or the art or the literature has come from in their experience, that helps us to understand better than just saying, well, you know, color is only skin deep. We're all the same. We're not all the same. There's cultural differences too.
Yeah, and even if we write, even if we ended up coming to the conclusion that we were right, that that's a lower thing, whatever that person is. Like I have a friend of mine who loves to diminish all of the racial things to, well, they ought to just pull up their pants. Okay, maybe pulling up their pants is a good value. I'm not trying to say that, but that diminishes the whole conversation. Right?
Yes.
And so I need to be in that conversation to hear why that not pulling up of pants is important and or valuable to them, whether or not I ever agree.
Well, one could also bring up the zoot suits that people wore in the 1940s and say, fashion, it shouldn't be something to judge somebody by.
Yeah, yeah.
But I do think
Our
this,
economy is based on that.
Absolutely, some of it. Michael, I saw you were going to talk.
I'm struggling with the assumption that our culture is somehow or other better than other cultures, and other people have to assimilate into what we hold as norms.
Yeah.
exactly.
And that's the struggle for me. So it's like, how do I not just acknowledge that a culture is different from mine, but how do I see it often?
Yeah, I think it has to do with value rather than better or worse. Do I still value it even if I don't choose it? Is there something about that that is worthwhile?
You know, I was fortunate to travel around. My job took me all around the world, and that was the most amazing thing, to see people, different cultures, different ways. I always used to say that we all look out the same window but see a different world, and that was a very powerful experience for expanding my recognition.
Yeah, and I do believe that's part of the issue sometimes. So at least two of you talked about coming from West Virginia, and West Virginia is like some of the areas of our country. Some people have never escaped out of their holler.
Yep.
They've never gotten out of that very narrow world that they're in, and so it's really easy to define people outside of that as wrong, bad, because of the difference there. But all of us have a certain amount of that, and that getting out of our holler, getting into a space where we connect with and begin to see people and maybe value within those people that we wouldn't have seen just from the very isolated place we were in. So Pam, you and I as well, we were basically in white neighborhoods growing up. There's not very many people of color in the places I grew up in.
But you know, the thing is, what segregation that there was, as I said, the other communities that sent to the high school did have people of color. There was never any laws about being segregated. If you know, it was definitely de facto rather than de jure. And I think that's one of the reasons when we all came together in the high school that, I mean, we had other problems in the high school, but I don't ever remember racial problems. And it may have just been that, you know, I just kept my head down in my classes and didn't participate, but I was in the band. We had, you know, it was mixed race and religion in the band and the chorus and everything else. And I'm not sure which is better, to have been in a place where the laws were that bad, or whether to have had it happen because this is the way people settled out. And I think there's negatives and positives of both sides of that. With the law, you knew where you stood. In the other, it was subtle.
Yeah. So let me tell you about my own growing up. I was born in this corner of Nebraska, way up in the middle of nowhere, on an army post that had recently been decommissioned. It was the army post from which all the Sioux wars originated from. It was not far from Wounded Knee. Crazy Horse was killed blocks from where I grew up. Okay, murdered. But basically, it was a lily white establishment when I was there, because those Sioux, those Indians, those Redskins, they lived a little further away.
That's why he was murdered.
That's why he was murdered. Exactly right. But the fact that I knew the story about Crazy Horse and maybe internalized it differently than how it was sometimes being told allowed me to see differently the rest of my life. Because I don't know, there was an inherent wrongness about that story as I read it. I couldn't just see him as the criminal that he was sometimes written off as. And that's what we often do, right? As we write off that unknown or the too well known in a certain story, and that affects the ways that we move forward as we go into similar stories. Right? Who is this new Indian in front of me? And is he like that redskin I knew? Or is he a Native American that I can relate to? And how I view that last relationship can affect this new relationship. So at least part of the issue is us choosing to see the person in front of us, not the race, right? Because sometimes if I only see the race, I step right into racism. Do I see the person and then see how that person's growing up in a particular race, in a particular economic, in a particular neighborhood, in a particular way of being, with particular parents who did this or didn't do that? Do I see all of that as I evaluate my relationship to them? All of that can give good and bad elements to that person in front of me. But if I write them off immediately by the bald head, right? Or by whatever I do, then I cheat myself out of a chance to be able to see them, truly see them. So what began to open your eyes? Where was it that somebody spoke in such a way or entered your world in such a way that you began seeing people differently than what you'd seen before that?
I'm not sure if this was really what did a lot for me, but one of the most striking things I remember was back in about 1953, 1954, when the integration movement was just beginning, that this fellow was a long, tall, thin black man, was walking down the street, and he was attacked by 6 or 8 young adults, white young adults. And I remember being completely shocked by that.
Yeah, like why would that happen?
Yeah, it was in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Yeah. See, that was not dissimilar to the question I was asking around Crazy Horse. Why? Why did he kill him? Why did they kill him? He'd given himself up peacefully. What was it that entered into that? And as a 6-year-old, it wasn't easy to find out, right? It didn't fit into my head.
Yeah.
But as I grew up, I was able to fit at least some of the stuff to it. How about the rest of you? What helped change you?
You
For
know,
me, oh, go ahead.
Barbara, I keep thinking that underneath all this is this element of fear that's given to us by our nuclear family. There's a subliminal message that we're raised with that is going to then be projected as we get out in the world and start meeting people.
Yeah.
And fear, parents, I would like to say they don't set out to create a child who's fearful, but they set out to keep you safe and be cautious and teach you how to.
Yeah.
So that's what keeps coming through my mind as we've been having this conversation is that baseline fear that maybe we're not even aware of, but it's there.
Yeah. And Phyllis, it's not always what we would recognize as fear either. I remember my mom, for example, at one point or another talking to me about how you don't want to get into a mixed race relationship because that will cause challenges to you that you don't want. And I think she meant and challenges for that other person as well, right? And I don't think she saw that as a racist thing. She saw it as a let me help you in life type of thing. But it also essentially said, and it's in some ways, that person is not worthy of my love. I'm not certain she meant it like that, but it's hard not to get that out of that. And there's a lot of things like that that we say that become the basis for bad action in the world. Barbara, you were going to say something.
Yes, the memories I have are probably, I was probably 16 before this happened, but the family, the Black family that lived out of town, which I realized later was because no realtor would sell them a house in town. The mother was a professor at the university, and they had 3 or 4 children, and was in a car accident with her where her infant daughter was killed in the car accident, and no one would sell them a cemetery plot.
Oh my gosh.
Oh boy.
And it was just like, how can you not do this? And by then I had also figured out that the town, another reason we didn't have any Black people in town was there was a town about 5-6 miles down the road that had on the other side of the tracks, all the Black families that were in the area lived in that other town. So.
Yeah, and there was a clear understanding that you as a child didn't have to know that whites belonged here and Blacks belonged there.
Never crossed my mind.
Yeah.
I just remembered we had to go a long ways to get to their house. That's what I remembered.
Yeah.
But I didn't have any other conscious awareness of it.
Yeah. But see, sometimes it's the non-conscious awareness that makes these things so deep and powerful within us, because that's just the way it is. And so we never question why it is that Black America has chosen their own town 3 miles away.
Yeah.
Right?
That's right.
We don't question a lot of things like that. Like, for example, I knew as a young adult that gay America had certain places in each city. What I didn't when I first started looking at that is think, why? And it was because of prejudice, wasn't it? And part of what we have to be, like I could say, I'm not racist, I'm not prejudiced against. But if I sit in just that space of not questioning, guess what I am?
I think
I'm
it's a
perpetuating racism. I'm perpetuating classism. I'm perpetuating all these things rather than helping to work against them.
Yeah, I think it takes a certain level of maturity, or to start to dig into that issue.
Yeah.
When you asked about what specific incident changed, I can't remember. It was just a continuous, ongoing, sort of becoming more and more aware of the discrimination that was all around me. But it wasn't until I didn't have an aha moment. It just kind of grew on its own. At
one point in the introduction, Ibram Kendi writes this: the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it and then dismantle it. And it takes one dismantling, then another, and then another. It doesn't just stop. It's almost like the string of letters, LGBTQ, and you keep adding as you realize somebody else that needs to be in that string of letters because someone else is being rejected. Someone else is being hurt. Someone else is being overlooked. And so what we have to do is continually say, how is it that right now somebody is not feeling the fullness of humanity from the people around them, from me? And the hard part is that it might mean that I have to be uncomfortable. And truly being anti-racist means that I have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. I have to choose to step into that space of discomfort so that I begin to fix it. So that in short is what we're going to talk about through these weeks. Here's how I foresee it happening. There's 18 chapters. So my hope would be to do 2 chapters a week. We may and may not get to all of those. Most of you look like, really intelligent, wonderful people. So I'm expecting that you might have some things to say. And so if we get through 1 chapter and that's all we get to 1 week, then we'll take a little bit longer, we'll take a little bit longer to get through the book. But so for next week, read the introduction, which is marvelous. There's a lot of really good things in there. I like this, the part on page 10 in my book. I don't know what it will be in yours, but he says this: I used to be racist most of the time. I am changing. And then he starts listing some of the things of where he's changing. I no longer identify with racists claiming to not be racist. All right. I am no longer speaking through the mask of racial neutrality. And he talks about some of his learning spaces. And so part of what you have to figure out is what are your learning spaces? What is it that today you are that you weren't 5 years ago or 10 years ago? So that you can also look and say, what is it I need to become 5 years from now or 10 years from now? Because at least one of the issues in society today is there's a huge thing of saying, I'm not racist, which essentially says, and you can't make me, right? And somehow what we have to say is, help me to move forward. Let's help each other to become better. And one of the biggest challenges to that will be whoever it is in your life that is still in that space of not wanting to move. And how do we help each other to find words and actions to move them? Many of you know about my ongoing struggle with a man named Mark. Mark is a dear person in my soul. He is remarkable in my own spiritual journey. He's also very opposite politically for me right now. So this week in a mutual friend's post, it seemed like one day he was responding snarkily to every single thing that she was posting, whatever it was, right? Very, very derogatory in many ways. And so my thing was, and we'd had a great conversation that was very deep and difficult because we were in different places, but that was, I think, helpful for both of us. And then he went silent, I think, because it was a challenging conversation. And so this was the first time he'd reemerged. And I had to decide, do I confront and how do I confront? Because of course, what you want to say is, you're such an SOB, right? And because some of that behavior is just that. But at least part of my thing was this, because his thing was, liberals never really want to talk. They just want to slam you over the head with their ideas. I said, look, I'm here to be in a conversation with you. You want to be in a conversation, here I am. Now, I think that you're wrong in a couple of different ways, so talk to me about why you think you're not. So
whenever you hear never, that's a flag, I think.
Absolutely, because it's much simpler, and we do it. He's right about how sometimes it feels like we, the opposite of him, is putting up a everyone has to. And we have to figure out how to be in that conversation anyway. Even though I have something that I think everyone should be, do I allow him a space to not be it yet? And does he do the same thing? And do we stay in conversation in order to help each other in that process? Because if we're not in conversation, then many of the things that I would say are don't do it will never affect him any longer. If I stay in conversation, there's a chance that some of those things begin to penetrate past his defenses. And I allow him to be less racist, even as I try to be less racist myself. How many know that that's a simple, easy path, and we'll be solving it really quickly? It's an ongoing issue. At the end of the chapter, Kendi says, we know how to be racist. We know how to pretend to be not racist. So let's know how to be anti-racist. That's what we're going to try to teach each other through the midst of all this, is how to take that next step in what to be. So read through the introduction in the first couple chapters, and we will talk next week more about all of this. Any last questions before we go?
We are talking about the introduction here just for a second.
Yes.
But I think his paragraph, a few paragraphs up from the one you were quoting a minute ago, is really important. It's not a problem of just seeing people as the problem. It's rather the policies that ensnare us all.
That's right. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really important. You should know my perspective of racism, even though he will say that he believes that a Black person can be racist. Okay, I'm not quite there. I believe systems are racist, not people. I think people are discriminatory, prejudice, but he believes, and there may be a reason why he holds to these wordings, because it's tough trying to get somebody who's holding on to one definition of racism to understand all the time what I'm talking about. I think he says, if I don't admit that I have problems in this area, then I can't expect that person to admit it. I think that's where he's coming from in that.
Would you please repeat, our assignment?
Oh, basically chapter 1 and 2. There's also a short introduction, but the introduction chapters 1 and 2 for next week.
What I meant was the questions we are to bring to it for ourselves. You articulated very well. And,
yeah,
and
I think you
86-year-old brain went.
I think the question you have to continue to ask throughout this class is how it is that you're still not perfect about it. How it is that you're still where you need to learn. And some of that is going to be really difficult because there's things that you don't even know that you're doing that someone else would take as wrong, or that you don't know what to do because two of your friends like two different things along those lines, right? So some people have been taught that the word Black is a wrong word to use, while someone else might say that the word African American is the wrong word to use. And how do you hear both those voices and value both those voices?
And what you call the people that you're identifying with, you know, if you're not using either of those. I saw a thing the other day where someone was talking about how do you know that the person isn't a Cuban Canadian? And, you know.
Yeah. So a lot of it has to do with asking yourself on a regular basis, what is the dynamic in this particular relationship? And what is standing in the way of movement from myself and the other person? Now, you can't always make the other person move. You might have noticed that in life. But you can,
Yep.
you can make the ground easier to plow, so to speak.
I thought the words you used earlier, where are my learning spaces, was helpful.
Thank you. Where are my learning spaces is always a good thing. Because I think that one of the difficulties of moving from not racist to anti-racist, not racist assumes that we're already there.
Yeah.
Where anti-racist is saying, I'm still learning, I'm still growing, I'm still becoming. All right?
Okay.
Now
Thank
you
very
mentioned
much.
you had
I look
you
forward to
mentioned you
seeing you
had
next week.
All right.
you mentioned you had a paper for each of us.
I will send that out. Oh, if I don't have, excuse me, thank you for doing that. If I don't have your email address, please type it into does everyone know how to do the
Chat.
the chat? Down on the bottom or sometimes up in the top left corner is a button that looked like a cartoon. Put your name in that, your email address, I'm sorry, in that, and I will send you out a piece of paper that you can have for that. In fact, I'll send you two things. I will send you the reading from Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Good.
All right,
Good.
so you can look at that. And that's from the introduction to his book. And then I will put down, these are my notes and a couple of different things. I should mention one of them. At the bottom of this sheet of paper, there's a quote, I guess you could say, from the movie The Hate You Give, which is the movie we're going to watch tomorrow night, or not watch, but talk about tomorrow morning and then Thursday night. And it's an amazing movie. If you have not seen that movie, you should watch it. It's about a young lady growing up in a very inner city Black neighborhood, but also being brought to a white high school because of opportunities and whatnot, and about the tension that enters in her life between those two worlds. Okay?
What's the title again?
I'll
of the
show it to
movie?
you.
I didn't hear it either.
He didn't say it because he didn't remember.
The Hate You Give.
The
Hate You Give.
Okay.
Okay, so that title comes from a Tupac quote. All right, the hate you give. And if you look at the first letters there of each of those words, it's T-H-E,
Thug.
thug. And Tupac went on to say thug life. And then that stands for, and I'm sorry about the word that I'm going to use, it says, the hate you give little infants fucks everybody. Thug life. And it's about how when we don't fix the hate, when we don't step into the changing of the racism, then we pass on hate and division that our little kids, that continues to mess up our little kids. So that's what we're ultimately trying to do, is to try to change ourselves so that we go that direction. Okay? Any last
Okay,
words?
see you in a week.
See you later.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Mhm.